Since the Overwatch League finals, you may have noticed, even on ladder, the meta is shifting away from some of the Zarya, Genji stuff that we had and towards the Winston Reaper. So what does this mean? How do you play in this new meta? Is there anything you need to do? Should you even care in a few days? Is this going to be gone when we shift to the new patch? Well, no, the new patch is actually going to drive us even harder towards this Winston Reaper meta, unless Contenders breaks it and finds something new, which is very possible. But even if they do, it'll take time for that to trickle through the ladder and people to start adjusting. So how do you play this one? What should you know? Well, there's a couple things. The first thing that you want to know is something that Shock is giving us a great example of. You generally want to approach these fights in two different groups, because if you approach in two different groups, you will have two different angles. And angles are how you win the poke phase. Angles are really, really powerful in Overwatch. I know people will call this six-man or zombie comp or talent dive or whatever, and they're thinking, oh, you just group everyone together and you just go. That's not really true when you're thinking about the neutral. If you can still get angle power out of your Sojourn, that's great. Would I more often put maybe Kiriko over here with my Sojourn and Lucio over here with my Reaper and Monkey? Yeah, probably. Still wanting Kiriko to have a sightline on the Monkey, but you know what? This split is perfectly fine. So that's one thing that we're aware of. And that's going to set us up. So what are you looking to do from here? Well, if you have that angle pressure, you're going to create situations where you are potentially looking to put pressure on the other team. The thing that you should immediately notice when looking at these two comps is, well, they're playing dive comps. So playing dive comps is great. We just dive someone, right? No, you can't just dive someone. Even if you've properly staged your dive, you can't just dive someone. And the reason is everyone on both teams has mobility. Lucio can wall right away, has amp if he needs it. Kiriko can teleport away with a log to someone. Winston can jump out. Reaper can wraith out. Sojourn can slide out. So you can't just dive someone, because if 3 or 4 of you use your mobility to get on top of a Sojourn who then slides away, you are now going to get counter dove on from angles by the other team, and it's going to be messy. So what do? Well, longtime watchers are going to know this. You use those angles that you took, and you outpoke the enemy team. Okay, you don't have the greatest poke in the world. You're running Reaper and Winston, for crying out loud. It's not like you're going to have great long-range poke. So you are looking to close the distance. Maybe instead of being here, you're going to work your way up to here, or vice versa, so that you have shorter sight lines to use. Maybe keep your Sojourn over here, something along those lines. Yes, that is what you want to do, and that's going to be just fine, because now you round the corner and you don't use your mobility. You might drop your Winston bubble. You might have your Reaper and Winston both round the corner while your Sojourn opens the angle and tries to shoot, and that is actually really key right now. You're looking not for a Winston that dives deep into the backline against a highly mobile team that has all their cooldowns. You're looking to spend something, like your Monkey Bubble, for example, to go ahead and create a window for your Sojourn to potentially try to get value, or for your Reaper to try to really force their Monkey to jump out, or force their Reaper to wraith out, which actually allows you to then either take space from the enemy team, or if they try to stay in when using their mobility cooldown, so maybe they jump out but very shallowly, or they use Wraith for invulnerability but then stay in, now you can go ahead and dive that Reaper, dive that Monkey, dive the Sojourn who slid into her team, who didn't manage to didn't manage to get away, that sort of thing. If someone stays in the front line without their mobility cooldown, that's potentially when you're looking to actually dive in this dive comp type scenario. And we talked a little bit about how to force this. You round the corner. If you're the tank, you want to round short corners. You can potentially use your bubble or your health pool to try to get this out. You want to hold on to your jump. If you have to use your jump, you're going to have to give up some space. No problem. Giving up space is better than dying. If you're DPS, you need to make sure that when your Winston rounds the corner, you, both DPS and preferably the Kiriko, have a good sight line to contribute to take advantage of this brief window. That's kind of what you're looking at. And it's a somewhat slow meta, you could say, in the neutral. But this is kind of complicated and hard to set up and really frustrating. So how do you shortcut it? Is there a way to do it better? There absolutely is, but that's where ults come into play. Ults are pretty darn important in this meta. But before we get into ults, let's look at this first neutral fight. We see Fearless jumped in here, and I'm going to call this a mistake. This is him using his mobility to go in here, which we're not a huge fan of. He uses this mobility to go in, and now the enemy team, Shock has sightlines on this Winston who's used his mobility and is now going to get shot at by 4 to 5 players, which isn't great for him, while his team is going to be late getting into a place where they can shoot at the other team. You see this? His group cannot shoot at the shot group over here. His group cannot shoot at the shot group over here. They might get there with Lucio speed, with their mobility, in like a second or so and not be very late, but a second of difference in these compositions is going to lead to a pretty darn meaningful pressure difference. And we're going to see that this does not lead to a terribly good place. So one monkey jumped in rather than just sort of walking around a corner here. We can see that Dallas is a little later in. We can already see these health totals aren't going great for Dallas here because, okay, Mikey lost some damage, sure, because Dallas eventually got here, but Fearless lost damage. It looks like Shock actually put more focus on Sparkle. This is going to force Sparkle to wraith out, as we see happening here. They're having to give up a ton of space because they lost all that health. They're thinking, oh no, we're going to go to points, but instead they're going to go ahead and go down because Fielder got caught over here without mobility. And that's what's going to happen. That's very much what's going to happen, and this evolved from that. But that was like a tricky fight to set up, and it's frustrating. So if we go back, how could you take these fights differently with ults? Well, there's a couple things that you really want to think about. You generally are going to think of support ults as the most powerful ults in these compositions. They're really good. If you have gate and you say gate towards the enemy team when the enemy team is in a place where it's not super, super easy for them to retreat, maybe as their Winston is jumping at you, you gate towards their backline, that's going to work pretty well. That's not a terrible way to start a fight, and you can sort of skip some of those setup steps. Yes, you absolutely want to still have some level of separation, your two groups if you can pull it off, but you don't have to do quite as much with the, hey, my monkey's going to round the corner, back off, and we're really going to make sure this, and we're going to create a health advantage. You almost want to skip some of that stuff because you would rather use your winning ult play before the opponents are able to get the last 20%, from 80 to 100% on their ult and have answers. And then the other thing you run into is when you start using ults, teams are more likely to inappropriately respond. If someone comes at you with a dive, it's pretty easy for the dove person to go, I'll use my mobility to leave, or maybe I'll get a Suzu, or maybe I'll get something that's going to help me out, or I'll drop a Winston bubble. Whatever the case may be there, that's just fine. You're less likely to have, when you get dove, 4 things go off to try to protect you, and you're more likely to have an appropriate response. But when, say, a gate comes at you, there's not time to coordinate. If you haven't pre-planned it well, maybe you pre-plan it well and you immediately respond with your own gate and beat and you win. Great. But if you didn't pre-plan the fight terribly well and you're the team being acted upon with this gate, you're going to be in a situation where you are much more likely to go, quick, we're going to amp speed out and we're going to Suzu because I'm scared, and Winston's going to jump out, and Reaper's going to wraith away, and oh shoot, we've spent all of our resources to try to leave this gate, and this other team, A, still has their resources, and B, recharges their resources more quickly even if they use them, and get to follow us and go ahead and do what they want. So it's very easy when a team is being acted upon, for that team being acted upon, to overreact and overspend resources because they don't know if they're going to get the Suzu. They don't know if their Winston is going to drop bubble or if he's going to jump out, those sorts of things. They don't know if their Suzu is immediately going to pop her own gate unless they had a plan. So in these situations, rather than some of this more careful setup like we saw in the neutral, we're looking to use these ults to force disproportionate reactions. Because if you fight plan these, even moderately, it works pretty well. And yes, even on ladder, some basic fight planning will carry you very, very far. Sometimes people are all going to be muted, and that's just life. But then we can get into some of this other ult use here. You can use beat. Beat can be a solid one where you can go in hard using your cooldowns. Because you use your cooldowns, the enemy team reacts either maybe they stay in, maybe they fight, whatever. You put beat on top of that. Maybe now you go ahead and use your amp to chase them because you use your other movement on the way in. Great. They've probably disproportionately drained resources, or they answer with their own ults, but they probably over ult because they didn't have the perfect plan of what they were going to do. Other things that you'd be aware of: Winston ult is frequently used to control DPS ults in this meta, though using a Winston ult on a gate means he basically has instant primal jumps, and that can be quite powerful once Winstons are familiar with it, so you can do some real damage with that. You're going to see the Sojourn ult. That's going to be great with off angles when the other team doesn't have beat. If they don't have beat, great, pop it, go have some fun. Primal Winston may show up to have some, to try to have his fun with you, but you're just not going to be too worried about that. You're going to have to find some times to use the ult. Blossom, of course, Blossom can work well when you have your own gate going. Blossom can work great when the opposing team has powerful ults to try to win the fight with, and you use it sort of as a lurking ult to try to take the ult fight fast. It is very hard to beat a team that has support ults when you don't. Support ults are the most valuable ults. One of the fastest ways to just sort of go, hey, we're going to try to take this fight, we're going to try to win this fight, rather than just kite away their support ults until they're over, would be we're going to pull the trigger first with a Blossom. So that can be a good answer there. If you're playing with one support ult and two support ults, though, very frequently, what you're going to have to do, if we're at lit up on both of these blue team support ults here, and we say only have one support ult on orange side, very frequently what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to plan to kite. So you might hold a little less deep. You might not have your Reaper set up with such an extreme flank, that sort of thing, because you're expecting to have to kite away from that first support ult. You're generally not going to be able to beat it, barring plans to just ambush them very quickly before they're ready, that sort of thing, which again, Blossom can be very good for. Are there tons of other things you could know about this comp? Absolutely, but this is meant to be a sort of brief primer to get you guys set up to figure out, hey, what can we do to drive this well? Because we're effectively looking at 6-man again, and 6-man doesn't play like a lot of other Overwatch stuff plays. I hope that makes sense. If you guys have any questions, you can throw them down in the comments. I'll try to get to some of them. If you're enjoying the content and want to see more Overwatch 2 stuff like this, drop a like, consider subscribing for more, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Temporal out.